Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Lincoln Economic and Finance Research Group, Lincoln International Business School, University of Lincoln, myself, Shrabani, and my colleague, Dr. Tobias Bruenner, would like to welcome you all in this panel discussion in our Resilient Lincolnshire webinar series, focusing on COVID-19 fallout and the challenges for global recovery response. So we are extremely delighted to introduce our distinguished speakers this afternoon. Dr. Kunal Sen, Director, UNU-WIDER and Professor of Development Economics in the Global Development Institute, the University of Manchester. Dr. Sumon Bhoumick, Professor and Chair in Finance, University of Sheffield. Dr. Tapash Mishra, Professor and Head of the Department, Banking and Finance, University of South Hampton. Dr. Sanchari Roy, Senior Lecturer, Associate Professor of Development Economics, King's College, London. She will be speaking to us from India. And Dr. Bibhas Saha, Reader in Economics at Durham University. So now we start our panel discussion today. So the pandemic COVID-19 is with us nearly couple of months, but it made the whole world stand still over 2 months. So in terms of critical statistics, nearly 4 million people are affected and over 278,000 people dead worldwide. So its effects are seen both in developed and developing countries, but the casualties are more for developed countries like US death over 76,000, UK death over 30,000. European countries like Spain, Italy, France, they are badly affected. So whole world is standstill on the same platform like lockdown. Everything mostly on negative side, but there are lots of food for thoughts in terms of economic impact and policies. So our question one addressed to Dr. Sen, Dr. Roy, and Dr. Saha. In terms of death, developing countries, they do not show very high rate, like Singapore death rate like 20, Hong Kong 4, Vietnam 0, India are below 2000. But what would be the effect in terms of the real economy, output, employment, and prices, both in developed and developing countries? Do developing countries suffer more than developed countries in spite of low casualties? And also we think of like COVID-19 and globalization, such as export, import sector, multinational supply chain. Will that suffer most even after easing lockdown? So can we say that globalization under threat to some extent, whether countries will be more cautious about opening up their economies further? So question to Dr. Sen, Dr. Roy, and Dr. Saha.
I can start with discussing some of the employment effects as part of the real economy effects that we are observing across the world for the COVID-19 pandemic. So like Shrabani said, I mean, it is affecting both the developed countries and the developing countries across the spectrum, but it is also emerging that the developing countries, although might be experiencing lower casualties or death, mortality rates, are actually probably going to bear a bigger brunt in terms of sort of the real economic effects, partly because of weak health systems, partly because of limited institutional and financial sort of leeway to actually provide support to the vulnerable populations, lots more informal sector workers, all of which is potentially going to contribute to this deadly mix of where one has to weigh the health costs versus the economic costs much more stringently in the context of developing countries. So I currently am I'm on sabbatical from King's and based in India. So we've been conducting a survey, a phone survey of informal sector workers in Delhi. And I would like to share some of the findings that are emerging from our survey. We just completed it a couple of days ago. We started it just after the Indian government announced the lockdown on the 24th of March. And we are finding that livelihoods are massively affected. And this is across the board. If you look at the UK or you look at the US or you look at European countries or East Asian countries, a lot of these countries are experiencing massive livelihood shocks. But in some sense, the severity of the shock is probably much high in an economy like India, where between 80 to 90% of workers actually are engaged in informal sector, right? So we are finding, we ran this survey with around 500 to 600 informal sector workers in various parts of Delhi. And we are finding that among the people we interviewed, nearly 80 to 85% report that they've lost their livelihoods due to the crisis. And not only themselves, they know of people, within their networks who have done the same. And even those who did manage to do a little bit of work, maybe, some part-time work or some work here and there, they report up to 80% reduction in their daily earnings. So we've all seen coming out of India these, rather distressing images of the migrant workers after the lockdown happened, trudging along the national highways back to their villages. That's a picture that is very, very, distressing and extremely sort of scary. But at the same time, there are also other poor residents who are probably a little less visible, but are bearing an equal cost of the pandemic in terms of their livelihoods. We are also finding, this is a little bit of a diversion out of the real economy, but it will eventually, it potentially has implications for workers, is that we are finding big impacts on mental health. And this is again something that is coming across in terms of the reports that are emerging from other parts of the world. So for instance, Timo Fetzer and a bunch of co-authors, they have run this online survey with 58 countries, where one of the key findings that are emerging is in terms of constant anxiety and depression and stress about financial and physical health. So we are finding very similar, a picture emerging in the context of these informal sector workers. And alongside support, fiscal support that needs to be provided and sort of transfers that need to be provided to the vulnerable section, we also need to consider how we will incorporate support for the emotional stress that a lot of people across the world are going through.
Right. So if I want to carry on, and let me answer the question that Saha asked about output. So if you look at the IMF's forecast for just came out last month, obviously the developed countries are going to take the bigger hit. So the forecast is that -6% of contraction GDP this year versus -2% for developing countries, emerging economies. So there is a bigger hit for developed countries, and that's pretty obvious because the pandemic, of course, started after China was much more evident in Europe and the US, and demand side effects are stronger there, negative demand side shocks. Of course, the interesting thing that I felt from the IMF's recent report is that in the global financial crisis, actually emerging and developing economies saw positive growth, lower growth than before, but positive growth. So this time around, that's not the case. This time around, there's going to be negative growth for this year and potentially even next year. So that's the first point, that yes, this time they will see a contraction compared to the GFC 2009, which is surprising in that sense because GFC was pretty severe shock. But of course, the developed countries are going to see a bigger hit. But I think one should differentiate between different kinds of developing countries. Which developing country is going to see the biggest hit in GDP? Well, the oil exporters. They're going to really see a huge contraction. The World Bank estimates about 8% drop in GDP. And apart from the oil exporters, that's the Nigerias, the Venezuelans of the world, also the metal exporters, because metal prices are dropping sharply. So commodity exporters, which are mostly in Africa and some in Latin America, not as much in Asia actually, you're going to see big contractions. And so there's an asymmetric effect even among developing countries. So that's one thing. The other thing is to keep in mind that there are two kinds of effects going on. There's a demand side effect, which is to do with the pandemic's effects in European markets, the US, and so on. There's a supply side effect, which is to do with lockdown policies, what the IMF calls the Great Lockdown. All right. So lockdown policies effects depends on the country in question. India's had a pretty severe lockdown policy, among the stringent, most stringent in the world. But there are many countries in Africa which haven't had lockdown policies. In fact, some have not had anywhere near what we see in the European context. Tanzania, for example, hasn't had lockdown policies. So in the African context, some have had, like South Africa, pretty severe ones, severe lockdown policies, but others haven't had. So supply side effects are going to be quite asymmetrical across the developing world. Some will see pretty negative supply side shocks where we have had the kind of what India has had, for example, but less so in Africa, in my view. So I think that's important to keep in mind, the symmetrical effect of the pandemic, both on the demand side and also on the supply side, to think about that a little bit more. Thank you.
Right, just picking on that. Yeah, some of the global forecasts are simply mind-blowing. If I touch on poverty, what we see, that's the World Bank recent, I think last month, they had made a forecast on that. Global poverty will rise by roughly about 0.7 percentage point. So, which means that the expected level of poverty globally was to be 7.9%, just under 8, 7.75 to 7.9, which is now going to be at 8.6% or so. Now that means, now this is $1.90 a day, which is the extreme poverty or absolute poverty. So we are talking about 49 million extra people now will be pushed below the absolute poverty line. Out of that, the sub-Saharan Africa will be the hardest hit, with 22.6 million people from sub-Saharan Africa will be this new, unfortunately, because of this bad luck, will be now poor. In South Asia, it's 15.6 million, of which India alone will have 12 million. Now, also we should keep in mind that we are seeing figures for India, unemployment figure of CMI estimates about 150 million. So this is the magnitude of the problem. So, and if we go by a slightly relaxed definition of $5.50 a day, we are going to see 100 million poor falling into extra people falling into the poverty trap. Now, closely linked to the issue of here, I would mention very briefly on inequality and then come back to poverty. It's a little bit more. I do not want to take too much time. One thing is that the picture on inequality is less clear in which way it's going to do from country to country, because depends on the different income groups' exposure to the work disruption. So invariably, the poor everywhere will be severely affected by lockdown of any variety. The middle class, on the other hand, are more likely to be little protected because of the nature of the work they do. So overall, inequality is going to go up, but how much in each country, that remains to be seen. Now, in this context, so I'll come back to on the poverty issue and make an observation. It may sound a bit anecdotal, but the story is more like this. What I heard from someone, this family was running a small business, and they used to make enough income every month to have a very decent standard of living. And on top of that, they were having a bit of savings every month as well. They were by no means poor. But with the sudden stoppage of everything, they just suddenly realized that they could sustain about 15 days to a month, but after a month, they realize they are in deep trouble. They just do not know how, even if things are restarted, how their business can be revived. The point I'm trying to say is that when we think of poor, we think of one big black box below the poverty line. But the reality is there are different grades of poverty, different grades of poor. They live in different social stratum, and the government response in India, to give you an example, has been for this category of poor, one sort of standard response: we will feed them with cooked meal once or twice a day, and the job done, responsibility is over. But that's not how people live anymore. People are ashamed to go stand in the long queue to receive some bowls of cooked rice. But that's the reality, that all these people who just fallen below the poverty line, or who just suddenly in a situation like this, and the very poor, they are all now clumped together under one sort of relief measure. And this is not at all going down well with the people. Unfortunately, government could not think of any sort of better way of handling this crisis. So I will stop here, but I was trying to give the overall picture of how serious the problem of poverty has come. And Sanchari, you spoke about your experience in Delhi, and this is the kind of sense I also got. You put a number of 80% reduction. Yes, it seems like, but people have pride, self-respect, but they are not treated as human beings. They're treated like beggars. That's the problem of government. This is not just in India, in many countries around the world.
All right, thank you. COVID-19 also had a big impact on or still has a big impact on the financial sector. Many governments and central banks have launched massive support programs, and the banking sector is challenged to process this cash and these support programs to give cash to businesses. How well, what's your opinion? How well is the financial sector coping in this pandemic so far? And what is your outlook for the financial sector and the banking sector specifically? So this is for Dr. Mishra and Dr. Bhoumick.
And Dr. Mishra, can I
yes, of course,
start,
please,
and you can chip in? And I think if you look back a little bit, if there is any silver lining from the financial crisis that we had about 12 years ago, it's that it shook the banking system significantly enough such that the regulators managed to step in at the time and sort of started focusing on several aspects of banking. That is, for example, the single biggest one was identifying banks which are systemic risks to the entire financial systems, looking at them very, very carefully and closely, coming up with the Basel III kind of regulations, which sort of force banks to divulge more information to the regulators, and of course to have to ensure that the banks are better capitalized. So I wrote a column in the Conversation a few days ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago, and for that I was looking at the data, and what the data told me is that the banks are now better capitalized than they were before the 2008 crisis, which essentially means that they are in a better position to withstand the problem or the challenges that they're going to face. And the other thing that has happened, of course, is that the central banks have been primed to a crisis. So whereas before at the time of the 2008 crisis, it perhaps took them a few days and maybe a weeks to sort of come up with the kind of measures that were necessary to stabilize the banking financial system. This time they were out of the running block, even before, the others were sounding the alarm. So I was, watching a podcast on CNBC, I think, podcast on the measures that the US Fed has taken. And it's really a wide range of measures to sort of ensure that there is enough flow of liquidity to the banking sector. Same things have been done around the world by the different central banks, at least in the developed countries, and that sort of goes a long way to ensure that there is sufficient liquidity in the market, there is sufficient sort of support for the banking sector. Not to mention that when, for example, the governments like the UK government comes up with fiscal measures, like the furlough scheme that we have over here, which prevents sort of the companies from getting into bankruptcy or other kinds of problems. Then of course you are essentially mitigating credit risk, right? And why I want to talk about that is this financial crisis, or that one we may still have, it's still not there, that we may still have end up having, is somewhat different from the one that we had in 2008. I mean, 2008 was a scenario which is a prime example of a financial crisis, which then spilled over into the real sector, because there was sort of assets were overpriced, in particular in the housing market, and they were packaged in ways such that there was a huge amount of uncertainty about which kind of securities or assets owned by the banking sector were good, bad, ugly, whatever. And that sort of froze up the entire financial sector. There was a liquidity problem of the worst kind. This time, however, the shock is much more likely to come from the credit risk side, because the way that banks sort of try to mitigate credit risk is, of course, they try to deal with issues, like they take on collateral, etc. So they make collateralized loans. But they also spread their risk across sectors, across countries, across companies, et cetera, so that, and certain regulators have explicit rules about how much concentration you can have, or stake you can have in a particular company, or how much exposure you can have in a company or a sector, and so on. But this time, as Kunal was pointing out, that because of the demand and supply shocks on both sides, the entire economy has frozen up, and it's not a matter of one sector or another. And this sort of creates this essentially makes the credit risk scenario very, very difficult and to manage, right? Now, thus far, banks have proven resilient. We know that in the UK, for example, in the last couple of weeks, a number of banks have set aside large amounts of money because they are envisaging that they may have to take charge. They may have to take a hit on their lending portfolios, right? So they have already set money aside. It's wiped off a large proportion of their potential profits, but they're still sort of pretty viable, right? So a big question here is, how long is this crisis going to go on? Because, let's assume that, suppose, let's hope not, but imagine that if this were to go on for like 2 years, right? That would have a devastating effect everywhere. And if the real sector were to crumble, then obviously it would have a knock-on effect on the balance sheets of the banks and the asset quality of the banks. And then, we don't really know at that point what would happen, because there's a limit to which, your capital adequacy ratios are going to help you, right? And central banks may have to up their game much, much, much more should that come to pass. But we are not there as yet. The one area that is talked about much less, and I'll sort of just briefly mention it, and then I'll sort of pass the baton over to Dr. Mishra, is that over the last, since the last crisis, because the interest rate was held at a fairly low level for a very long period of time, it has started going up, especially in the US and then also in the UK, but it was held at a very, very low level for a very long period of time. And this led to essentially a corporate debt binge. So, and if you look at it, just to give you a sense of it, around 2020, at the start of the year of 2019 end, the stock of corporate debt was about just over $7 trillion, right? The problem is not the $7 trillion bits, right? The problem is that about 3.7 trillion out of that was triple B. Triple B is the lowest investment grade category, right? Now, if there is if there's a real sector crisis now, which is what we are observing, which is what the previous speakers talked about, and this sort of affects the profitability, the cash flows, et cetera, which essentially sort of makes, pushes these debt, these bonds essentially from a triple B category to a slightly lower category, then they effectively become junk bonds, right? Now, the question is what knock-on effect that would have on the overall sort of a financial sector, in particular the ability of these companies to borrow in the future, in terms of the asset quality of the number of different entities like pension funds and like mutual funds and the others who are holding this debt. It's certainly going to be a very stressful scenario. What exactly is going to happen would once again depend on the tenure of this crisis that we are going under. And to end up with the one last word on sort of the banking sector, I came across the BICRA ratings, BICRA standing for Banking Industry Country Risk Assessment, which is given out by the S&P Financial Services. So what they do is, on one axis, they have low risk industry risk, it's industry risk, low to high risk on a scale of 1 to 10. And on another, they have economic risk, which is again from 1 to 10. 1 being sort of low risk and 10 being high risk. So if you look at a country like sort of the US or the UK, it's 3 on the industry risk side. So it's, the banking sector risk is not perceived to be huge. But if you look at what is happening on the economic risk side, it's 4 and rising, right? So the hit is likely to come from whatever is happening to the real sector, right, because of the crisis, being translated into credit risk, and therefore taking a hit on the balance sheet of the banks or the asset side of the banks, right? If you look at the emerging markets like Brazil, China, Russia, and India, their industry risk is higher, as are their economic risks, right? So there's 5 or 6 on both those scales, right? So that's where they are. So over to Dr. Mishra.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhoumick. You have really stressed upon the role of interest rate and different aspects of the banking system. I really agree with you. What I actually call this current COVID crisis, I coin it like a great compression, perhaps due to the sheer scale of impact spread across each point of contact in our socio-economic space that influences our decision making. In addition to the perceived impacts on the banking assets and their mobilities, I think one serious impact one can think about, it is much talked about these days, and it also depends upon, it stems out from some of my recent research, is the impact on the SME. But before to that, let me just point out a small point here that the recent Global Financial Stability Report by the IMF, it shows that the financial system has actually already felt a dramatic impact, and a further intensification of the crisis actually can affect the global financial stability. However, the banks, the IMF feels that have more capital and liquidity now than in the past. But they have been also subject to stress test and greater supervisory scrutiny in recent years. So that has put them in a actually relatively better position than at the onset of the global financial crisis. In addition, I think there is substantial and coordinated action by the central banks to provide liquidity to banks in many economies, which should stop elevate potential liquidity strains. Now, coming back to the impacts of this asset holding or price of the banks on the SMEs. As we know that SMEs, the immediate impact of COVID-19 crisis through the financial intermediary panel would be on the SMEs, because in many developing countries, including the developed ones, the SMEs actually contribute significantly to the innovation and sustainability of economic growth. In fact, in Sweden, there is a significant report that most of the innovations that come, that is reported year on year basis as a number of patents, they come from the SME. That's why in Sweden, they have a very dedicated program to support SMEs through different panels of financing. Now, when banks are extremely credit constrained, due perhaps to the onslaught of a sudden rise in demand for cash, once we come out of this COVID-19 situations, hopefully in a few months' time. And so then to meet that amount of demand, the government might have to pump a lot of cash, and that the government in different countries, for instance, in US, $700 billion funding has already been spent. So that is a kind of thing that the government has to put across different banks, which can actually translate into the SME spending. So a major incentive from the bank will be to revive the SME's growth once again. So this is the kind of challenge, because we have no depth of the demand side of the economy. There will be always a kind of demand-driven economy, but on the supply side, because of the cash constraints, this is where the supply and demand mismatch will lead to a disequilibrium into the economy and the financial system. So that is where I think the major challenge of the international government will be to secure funds, to devise mechanisms to revive the SMEs through proper banking channels, and to secure their loans, to make them feel comfortable. So this is one aspect of the SMEs growth that I think is extremely important. And I think also the current financial system is more resilient and especially better placed to sustain financing to the real economy because of the G20 regulatory reforms in the aftermath of the GFC. These reforms have actually improved the resilience of our core financial system. And now large banks actually are better capitalized, leveraged, and actually they hold more liquidity than before. And they have remained resilient throughout the market space. So that is my opinion, that that you have already stressed a lot on the bank rates and interest rate part. But on the other side, my focus is at the moment is on the SMEs growth. It is extremely important for the revival of the economic growth in many developed and developing economies. And that is why it's a bit more emphasis should be on the government how to revive those SMEs for funding channels, or ensuring that finances are secured and they are really given a lot of confidence to the innovation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, next question is based like similar to Great Depression. We can see that role of government is very evident in this crisis, and millions and billions of dollars relief or support packages by the government in most of the countries in the world. So obviously we can see that it will raise the government debt. So what would be the impact of government debt and its financing in the short run and in the long run? And how long government can support this? So this is for Dr. Sen and Dr. Bhoumick.
Professor Bhoumick, do you want to start? Because you want to talk about the data first? You need to unmute your mic.
Sorry about that. I think it's unmuted now. I was looking at the data for this, and I mean, and the challenges, the are two different kinds of challenge that developing countries face. One is with respect to their fiscal space internally. Now, that is fairly restricted pretty much everywhere, I would argue. However, one of the advantages of being a developed country, especially one with a hard currency, is that it is relatively easy to sort of tap the markets to be able to finance your debt. So for example, if you look at the UK and the US, it is expected that both these countries would incur fiscal deficits this year in excess, well in excess of 10%. And we are talking about anywhere between 14 and 18%, perhaps, according to different estimates. However, if you look at the interest rates on the bonds of these countries, I was looking at the US market, and the US bond spread, the yield curves, it sort of starts at 0.1% at the lower end. And if you go up all the way to 30-year bonds, we are talking about 1.27%, right? If you look at the UK bonds, it's fairly similar. It's sort of 0.12% for a 1-month bond, going up to 0.58% for a 30-year bond over here. Now, on the one hand, this suggests that the market seems to feel that the economies are going to be in a fairly depressed state for a long time. So there's no question of raising interest rates for a long period of time. But on the other hand, this also means that the governments are in a position to raise money at a fairly low rate. And if you also look at what has been happening, money has flown out of some emerging markets, at least over March and April. In basically, whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's uncertainty, money flows from high-risk economies to lower-risk economies or lower-risk currencies, right? And so the hard currency regimes also have that advantage, right? So these countries are able to do that. That also, I was listening to a CNN talk yesterday where I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was the opinion of Larry Summers, that developed countries have a tax base. And in principle, it is possible to tap into it to raise taxes, corporation tax, as well as individual tax, once the crisis is over. So even if you your debt exceeds 100% of GDP, etc., you still have the ability to do that, right? So the two things together puts the developed countries at an advantage, even though the fiscal space may seem to be fairly small. But if you take India as a case in point, and I refer to India simply because I'm more familiar with the data there than perhaps data of other countries, other developing countries. The tax to GDP ratio is well below 20%. If I'm not mistaken, Kunal, it is possibly around 12 to 14% or 15% thereabouts, and only about 14-15% of the population or the working population pays tax. Right now, in that kind of a scenario, it's very, very difficult to raise taxation, to tax people and raise tax revenue even after the crisis is over. At the same time, these countries would find it obviously more difficult than developed countries to tap the bond market, right? So there is that problem. Now, then we move over to the overseas the debt kind of scenario, because that's another source of getting money, of raising funds. If you can't raise the money internally, where do you go? You can tap the external market. I was looking at a very interesting paper I think this is by people from the Dallas Fed. And they define, they come up with a measure which says that you take the foreign currency reserves of a country, you take away from that the one short-term debt obligations, like about 1 year, what you have to pay for about 1 year. You take out the current account deficit, whatever that amounts to, right? Whatever remains tells you how resilient you are, because that essentially means that if you have a positive number in terms of reserves, you can possibly go for 1 more year without actually having to borrow money, etc., etc. So that kind of measure. So one good thing is that when you look at the countries among developing countries, those who are the larger ones, the faster growing ones, the bigger ones, countries like the BRICS countries, but also countries such as Mexico, such as Poland, and so on and so forth. And Poland has become an OECD country, obviously, in a sense. But if we consider that as I'm looking at the data over here, they include Poland and Hungary in this data as well. The situation now is actually not nearly as bad as it was earlier, because before the 2008 crisis, there were at least 4 countries for which this number that I just talked about was negative, right? Whereas now the only country that has a negative number is actually Argentina, which is going through its own crisis, mini crisis right now. However, if you look at the the information that is being put out by organizations like the IMF, the low-income countries are hugely vulnerable. right? And the low-income countries, there's sort of general consensus that for these countries, that ability to sort of pay back the external debt that they have, forget about borrowing, but even to pay back what they have right now, may not be possible unless there is a debt forgiveness of some kind, unless there's a serious haircut that is taken by whoever the lenders are, or unless we go back to some kind of a Brady, bond kind of a scenario of the late 80s, whereby we sort of restructure the entire sort of loan portfolio of these countries, right? So there is a huge difference, therefore, among the developing countries between the sort of larger, faster growing emerging markets and the low income economies. And both of these together would be able, both the internal fiscal position as well as their ability to borrow overseas or sort of sustain a debt level overseas debt levels. This would essentially tell us how far these countries can go, how much fiscal space they may have in sort of mitigating the impact of the crisis that we are facing now. But I'm sure Dr. Sen would have a lot to say about that.
So I think I'll just pick up on what Prof. Bhoumick said about external debt. First of all, let's be clear about one thing. Almost all the countries in Africa and some in Latin America were already in a bad space, fiscal space, even before the pandemic. Almost all the sub-Saharan African countries had very high debt to GDP ratios, debt to export ratios. They were already in a situation they were looking at debt default, and then the pandemic hit. And of course, a lot of the countries that are in that space are also the commodity exporters, the Angolas, the Mozambiques, the Nigerias, and so on. So now they're in a very bad space. Not only do they already have a very fragile debt situation from before, and now we have a situation where their export earnings have collapsed. Whether it's tourism, whether it's remittances, whether it's commodity exports, pretty much everything, all of the sources of revenue, external revenues have collapsed. So they are in a situation where they have a balance of payments problem. They have extremely fragile debt situations where they might get into debt default at any moment, really. Just take an example, Angola. Angola is not exactly a rich country, but it's a major oil exporter, right, in sub-Saharan Africa. In Angola, the debt, the spread on its debt, external debt, has jumped up 20 times. Angola is already in a distressed debt situation. This is just within the last few weeks, really. So if you think about countries like Angola in Africa, I think that we are looking at a very difficult situation, but where it's not obvious what should be done about it. And there is one difference between the earlier initiative on debt forgiveness versus now. Already we've seen in G20, they have now agreed to a debt moratorium, which is pretty much kicking the can down the road, because all that they're doing is they're saying to the countries now, well, okay, you don't pay us now, but a few years time, you've got to pay us the debt service. So that's not exactly what we're looking for, really. But there's this one elephant in the room, and that's China. Unlike before, China is now the biggest lender in Africa. And China's, from their point of view, it's not very obvious why should they agree to debt forgiveness, because that would put a lot of stress on their own banks. And so now we have a very strange situation, a South-South coordination problem. And I'm not sure, in my view is that we will not see a resolution of this problem. Apart from the fact that we have a lot of private debt out there, especially from African countries who borrowed quite heavily in the last few years from private sources. We also have this complication with China. So that's one thing. The second thing is that over 100 countries went to the IMF in the last few weeks asking for some support. The IMF already had about $150 million pre-pandemic in terms of rapid credit facilities. They pretty much were right at they had almost finished whatever they had. In the last few weeks, I believe there has been a replenishment of that of the facility to about $500 million, but that may not be enough. Now, what you really need is a huge increase in special drawing rights, SDRs. In the GFC crisis, there was about $279 million of SDR support. We're now looking at $1 trillion of SDR support. But again, there's no agreement among the major countries and Western countries on what should be the increase in SDR support for the low-income countries, because that's really the best way to deal with this problem. Part of the problem is the US can't really see eye to eye with European countries on this. And from what one can see, there's been very little agreement on how much increase can there be on special drawing rights. So we seem to see a lack of kind of coordination among Western countries, a particular problem with China coming in now as a major lender in Africa. And we also see a problem where already we have had many of these countries, especially in Africa, but also some in Latin America, who have had not been saving up for this problem. In other words, when they had the chance to put their windfall from revenues on and so on into fiscal buffers, didn't do that. The only country that did that, not surprising, is Chile. But not even in other Latin American countries we see that. So we are in a bad space in this situation where we don't really see, especially in Africa, countries in any kind of where they don't have any opportunity right now to invest in public health and so on, because pretty much what's happening in these countries is a lot of what they have from is being simply paying off external debt. And I do not see how that can be solved without some fundamental reform at the global level.
Thank you. The pandemic poses a big test to countries' health systems as well. And health systems differ widely across countries. Some have public health systems, others rely more on private healthcare. There are decentralized systems and centralized systems. So what are the lessons we have learned so far from the pandemic? Which health systems perform better? And this is a question to Dr. Saha and Dr. Mishra.
Right. So, Tapash, you want to go ahead?
Of course, sir. Sure. Thank you very much. Well, it's an interesting question. I think the benefits of healthcare decentralization actually include what we call the local decision making, and that serves as the specific needs of the population and targeting the specific amount of resource allocation. And it covers a feeling of public ownership through a more democratic. So basically, which type of whether decentralization or centralized public healthcare system is important or delivers most efficient outcome is actually quite debatable. Although experts say that it is too early to determine what role different systems actually can play in managing the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is, of course, undeniable that each country's structural organization actually influences their public health response. At the end, it should be clear that the decentralized and centralized healthcare systems have actually the relative advantages and drawbacks. So how different institutions actually shape the pandemic responses, and they help protect the patients, the physicians, hospitals, and of course control future outbreaks. And good responses will be judged in good light after the pandemic situation is over. What I feel is that not that just a centralized system is the most efficient system to deliver a very good, optimal healthcare. Decentralized system, but it is managed efficiently at the granular level, that can also provide a very efficient management of resources. There is challenge though, how to say communicate the ideas from the top bosses to the smaller regions. That communication is extremely important. But whenever it comes down to the centralized system, as we have seen in the case of China, there are some people have thought about some compromises with regard to the treatment to their citizens and people's rights. But on the other hand, if we look at the decentralized system, when people have their say on the type of outcome they receive, but there are certain situations where I think that the centralized system probably could deliver more efficient outcomes. So thank you very much. Yes,
right. Okay. So because of time, I'll try to be quick. For pandemic, there are two issues here. One is, of course, a collective action problem, and that's where we need public healthcare. The second part is we earlier discussed is the externality and the benefits of lockdown, etc., which requires probably a Keynesian type of solution of one group, better off group subsidizing the others and so on. So I'll speak on the collective action issue here. We have two glaring examples. One is US, the other one is UK, the two highest death rates at the moment in the world. US predominantly a private healthcare system, UK NHS, a public healthcare system. Both countries have failed. And why? So public and private is a factor, we'll see that, but the most important is it's not enough. There is something more you need to do, and we know now for pandemic, you need both quick response and timely preparation. For political or other reasons, neither country's government acted in time or acted judiciously. Of course, there are plenty of room for private and public collaboration. To give you an example, for example, like testing kits. Now we were seeing a lot of companies coming up with the cheaper sort of test kits. It can be done very widely if it is done through markets and smaller NGOs and so on. At a widespread level, it can be conducted for the benefit of the society, not entirely depending on the state. But when it comes to medicine and hospital capacity, etc., we need to have a public healthcare, because you cannot have ability to pay as the main determinant of service at the point of treatment. That's simply a disaster. So I would say we need a strong public healthcare system, but also a prolonged and preparedness that has to be also in place, as in countries like Germany, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong. These countries have shown with great deal of success how you can be well prepared and keep the fatality low. Thank you.
May I also add a couple of points with regard to that as well? Just I forgot in my previous discussion that I think in my mind, the decentralized system that can enforce a level of unilateral decision making regard to, say, for instance, quick mobilization of resources, or to ensure a strong relationship between, for instance, science, policy, and the capacity of leaderships to issue a plan and to issue a set of guidelines to inform people. I think that is extremely important. So a nice mixture of some elements of the centralized decision-making and decentralized process, that can help. Thank you.
Okay, we can have our last question to Dr. Saha, that the search for the vaccine and the intellectual property right issues.
Right.
Recently, that Stiglitz argue that the absence of public intervention will remain reliant on life-saving drug and vaccine on a monopoly-driven system that favored the profit that the people get over the people.
Right. And I think Sanchari will speak after me on this, or I alone?
You can go ahead, and I can
After,
my thoughts after
All
you.
right.
Yeah,
Sure. Okay. So I'll share a slide that I have with you. Let's see. Ooh, can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Hold on. I'm just kind of thrown out. Oh, hold on. Where is it? Play from these. So do you see a slide of the map?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So where are we now as far as the vaccine is concerned? Well, at the moment, there seems to be about 10 active efforts or researches going on around the world, of which 4 are in China, 3 in the US, 1 UK, 1 Germany, 1 Australia. Now, this is a race, and whoever reach the end point will have a big reward at the end. Now, the problem with the vaccine, of course, we need to keep in mind the vaccine is not the only thing we need, but we also need development of the medicine and treatment, etc. But here comes the intellectual property rights issue. At the moment, there are 3 important drugs which are very promising for COVID-19, are all under patents. And this has been a huge problem for developing countries and even some developed countries. It's very expensive. The similar concern is now about the vaccine as well. We also need to keep in mind just a news report that came, I think, this one, there was on May 4, there was a conference of 110 or 20 countries around the world. And these were head of the states all attended and pledged support for a global initiative for treatment, for development of vaccine. Surprisingly, US did not attend. Neither did Russia and India. There is no good explanation offered by any of these countries. China did. However, China replaced their head of state with a junior diplomat. So this is a very kind of questionable, this puts a question mark on the global cooperation issue. Mind that if governments don't participate in this, you know, from every corner of the world, the vaccine may not be made easily available to the rest of the world. And this should be, this is no longer a sort of a intellectual property rights issue, but it's a sort of, at the end of the day, it's a humanitarian issue, it's a moral issue. Just to, you know, highlight from one of the points from Stiglitz's article, that pneumonia still kills hundreds of thousands of children, babies around the world. Just in India, around 100,000. And there is a vaccine to immunize children against influenza, and that vaccine is under patents from Pfizer. Pfizer earns $5 billion every year from this vaccine, but because it is expensive, lots of babies, infants die. Similarly, PPE, you know, 3M holds patents over N95 masks and various other equipments, gloves, and that has been a massive problem. So the problem that we see is profit over, what is that? Profit over people, a mantra of capitalism, and that's where we need to come out of it. Okay, I think I'll stop here.
I think we have just few questions from the audience that we can go just very quickly. Okay, question to that from audience in case to Bijan Chakraborty. As a developing country of BRIC nations, India also have suffering to manage its fiscal deficit for last couple of years before the commencement of pandemic. My question to Professor Bibhas Saha that how India's central bank should move. Should they proceed more spending to generate demand in the ground level, discarding fiscal management, or they should adopt a balancing approach?
Right, even though it's addressed to me, but there are more qualified people in the panel, I think they will pick it up. I will just say, it's as many experts have already said, that it's time for Keynesian solution. You need to give money in the hands of the people to generate demand and forget about fiscal discipline for the time being. If somebody, Kunal or Sumon can add something, please.
And the only thing I would add to what you said, Bibhas, which I agree with, is that there's a specific nature of this pandemic which is different from previous depressions, right? That's a supply side problem here. So the fiscal policy, which is why in the UK, we have this furloughing going on. I mean, the standard way we do it in the Keynesian type policy would be cutting taxes. So what's the point of cutting taxes now? I mean, where are you going to spend your money? So that part of it, the supply side problem, is something that's quite specific here, which is why fiscal policy not only has to act on the demand side, as you said, but also on the supply side. And that's a challenge for a country like India, because in the UK, what they could do with furloughing, for example, is just not possible in India, partly because we have a large informal sector, which Sanchari mentioned, and partly also how exactly do you start doing the kind of support that we see in the US, mostly not in the US, that was the UK and in France, in providing support to self-employed and to the wage employed. So that is a very specific issue, and I would be quite interested to hear others' view on this. How do we solve the supply side problem, particularly in India, along with the standard demand side Keynesian type approaches?
I think to me, it sounds like a graded, it seems to be a graded approach might work. I mean, first we need money in the hands of the poor and sort of, the large section of the population, which are at this point in time vulnerable. And potentially, like Professor Saha was saying, putting money in the hands of people, forgetting about fiscal discipline at this point in time, monetization, right? We have to get that process going, and also basically ensuring mechanisms of starting economic activity and bringing people back to work. And this is where I feel the very stringent but extremely one size fit all approach of the lockdown, probably it was needed at the beginning, but now that we seem to have pushed the sort of peak into maybe June or July in India, at this point in time we need a graded and calibrated relaxation of the lockdown approach. So we need a data driven approach which will give us a better sense of what should be the containment areas, with an approach to sort of reimposing the lockdown and sort of relaxing it depending on how the different spaces are doing, which to some extent it seems to be the approach that the government is following, especially using the color coded sort of red, orange, green designation. However, one thing I feel the government of India could engage a little bit more is the point about decentralization that was raised by Professor Mishra before. He was talking about in the context of health systems, but overall in the context of India, there is a lot of clamor from the state governments to have a bit more autonomy to determine, what should be the approach that is going on in their states and in their regions. So the whole idea would be to mobilize and utilize local understanding and local expertise, potentially even accessing communities network support without letting it descend into vigilantism, but essentially using more local support to understand and implement a graded and calibrated containment / lockdown and release approach that will start the economic process running and sort of start putting in some of the workers back into work.
Okay, another one we can take, Dipankar Saha. Migrant labor is becoming a critical issue in managing infection in India. Is it prevalent other affected countries like Brazil? Anyone can answer this?
Yeah, I can say this. I had, I mean, I've been very critical of not the lockdown as such, but the outright blanket lockdown in India over the entire economy, every activity in 4 hours notice. That just absolute brutal. And I think it is, in a way, it has caused many more harms. So the migrant workers story is a glaring example of that. In fact, if I think about it, cities are the most dangerous place to live in this kind of pandemic. If we go back history, either during the time of bubonic plague or even earlier, we would always see that in Europe, in UK, the rich and aristocrat fled the city, went into countryside. So the migrants people who are running hundreds of miles from Delhi to Bihar, UP, etc., they were trying to go to safety, both to be safe from the disease, as well as to ensure to get 2 meals a day. Because our villages are still has a basic safety net still built into it. That's how villages have been historically there all along. So people are smart. In fact, many of these migrants were asked, why are they walking back? Most of them, I was surprised, did not answer because of the food, but they said because of the fear of the disease. This part is neglected because, again, we tend to think of all poor as ignorant, hungry, deprived, as a mass. Now, government should try to do, given that whatever has happened, there is some efforts now going on to help them reach their village and try to test them either at the starting point or at the end point and see how they are carrying infection and not. What I'm reading from various sources is that at the local level in villages, people are coming with all kind of innovative ways of containing the spread, self-isolating, etc., etc. What should also do, I also believe, as Sanchari said, there has to be a graded kind of approach to lockdown lifting or imposing lockdown. So the migrants, I fear the migrants are not going to come back to the cities for a year or so. That's what is going to happen. That means it will be very difficult in the cities of Delhi or Mumbai to get the kind of services they were getting, low-cost services for everything from the migrants in the past. They are not going to come back. And India has to live with this reality, but people in the villages will be safe. They won't be very well fed, but they won't go utterly hungry, except in few places. Agriculture has not been bad this year. So I think the future is not that bleak, but let people go to their home, to their safety.
Okay, final one we can take from Origi Roy. Wasn't this economic problem coming anyway? COVID has just preponed it.
Anybody?
Yes.
Well, see, the thing is that there is a if you peruse anything that is related to the financial sector, there are people who sort of every third month or second month, they sort of say that there's a financial crash coming and this time it will be worse than the last one, right? And so, if you repeat that every 2 months, then sooner or later it will sort of be true, because it will, in the 10th year this will be true, right? So the question for me would be, what are the obvious signs that there was a financial, that there was a major crash coming, right? I mean, is it that there was a structural change in the trends in unemployment rate? Was there a structural change in the sort of the growth patterns of the country? Yes, I mean, some countries had slowed down. I mean, India and China being the two largest countries being among them. But slowdown is not the same as a crisis, right? And we have to bear that in mind. So my question to anybody who asks me that question would be, so first tell me, what were the obvious signs that we were going to get into not a cyclical downturn, which is inevitable in any capitalist system. You would have business cycles and you'd have cyclical downturns, but that we were going to get into a major crisis, which is essentially structural in nature in some sense, right? And thus far, I don't have any good answers to that question. I mean, I haven't read anything that has convinced me that there was something structurally wrong with what was going on in the world economy, right? Yes, there was inequality, there was high levels of poverty in different countries, which is all about capabilities and social justice and issues like that. And as somebody who has read people like Rawls and Sen, I sort of I can empathize with that aspect of it, but we are not talking about that. We are not talking about the distributional issues. My sense is that the question is about the output levels and whatever goes with that. And somebody has to sort of point me to the data that suggests that there was a structural problem in the data that suggests that a crash was coming. I must admit that maybe it's my problem, but I must admit that I didn't see this kind of a crash coming. Downturn, yes. Cyclical downturn, yes. But this kind of a crash, I didn't see coming.
I have a small point to mention here. I think whoever asked this question, it's a very interesting one. I read an article a couple of days ago from an NVR working paper, which said that the yield curve, those who know about yield curve, this is actually a line that plots the yields of the interest rate of bonds having equal credit quality, but actually that differ according to their maturity dates. So basically the slope of the yield curve gives an idea of the future interest rate and the changes in economic activity. So yield curves can predict economic growth. So I read this article which said that for 2020 March and onwards, the yield curve was getting reversed. So inverse of the yield curve. So somebody predicted that there would be, a prolonged period of global recession. But this COVID-19 really exacerbated the situation. That could be one measure that the yield curve could predict, but there has been a reversal of the yield curve in recent times. So that could be true.
Can I add something here, if there is time?
Yeah, just the last one.
Okay. So I think the 2 points, as Sumon on Sumon's point. Well, the world economy was not in any. Yes, there were no signs like this, and the financial sector was fine. But there has been a growing problem, which is more of a, you can say, political economy type of problem, as the US has become more isolationist, and in UK we see more Brexit again, kind of a breaking away from globalized internationalization to a more nationalistic politics, and take even Russia and India everywhere. So that created a problem of coming together in this pandemic crisis. The world is not coming together, and I fear on that issue we have a much bigger problems lying ahead. But the Western countries generally, they respond to common sense, and sometimes they are able to quickly use their common sense. As for India, India was already in a tricky situation with two problems: demonetization and the GST, and economy was in trouble. So that created a special problem for India, but the COVID-19 just came from nowhere. So it is a surprise, but to respond to the crisis, the kind of strength you need, India certainly did not have that. And because of its own doing, honestly, nothing else.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions, but because of that time constant, we cannot answer. So we would like to thank you all for your time this afternoon. And I know that you all have a very busy schedule. So this stream will be live in FB, and we spoke and it is recorded version will be available via LIPS Facebook and YouTube. And many thanks also goes to Ms. Ruchi Agarwal and Director of Business and Development LIPS, and Mr. Tarjem Shokar, Marketing Manager of LIPS, and their entire team for organizing this webinar this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for invitation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.